My mother was different. From the moment I could form memories, she forced me to pretend I was mute. She called me son, bound my chest tightly with strips of cloth, made me urinate. Standing up, and kept me tethered to our shack with a dog leash. My name, she whispered when we were alone, was Seraphina, but to everyone else, I was just the mute boy. I was 11, a skinny, awkward thing, all elbows and knees, when Ragnar, the village headman, and 4 of his relatives came to visit my mother. I was used to these visits. Men came often. They gave my mother small coins, or sometimes a handful of rice. They would disappear inside the shack, and I'd be left outside, listening to the rhythmic creaking of the bed. That day, Ragnar's voice boomed through the thin walls. Pity the mute isn't a girl. We could have had some real fun, have her bear us children in turns. And at that very moment, a strange warmth bloomed between my legs. A trickle of red stained my rough, homespun trousers. My first blood. It was terrifying and confusing, a secret I knew I had to keep. Later, I was returning from the woods, where I'd been gathering wild berries. The mountain forest was swarming with mosquitoes, and I was covered in itchy welts. The village, nestled deep within the mountains, was unusually lively. 2 women, Helga and Astrid, had given birth. I arrived back just as the births were finished. 2 wrinkled, pink bundles lay on blankets. The midwife, a stern woman named Morwen, held up Helga's baby first. "A boy," she proclaimed. A cheer went up from the small crowd gathered around. Morwen then lifted Astrid's child. "A girl," she announced, her voice flat. The smile vanished from Torvind's face, the father. He snatched the wailing infant by 1 foot, examining her with disgust. "Ugly thing," he muttered. "What did you expect?" Ragnar scoffed. 500 yuan for a wife, and you think you'll get a beauty? Best drown her. Save a lot of rice. The schoolteacher, a gaunt man called Silas, nodded in agreement. In this village, only the madwoman's child was ever any good. Pity she's ruined now, can't bear any more. Look at the mute, though. Already has his mother's allure. His gaze fell upon me, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. He beckoned me over. "Come here, mute. I've got something for you." At the village entrance, a rough stone table was laden with white, steamed buns. A feast. My mouth watered uncontrollably. I couldn't resist. Shouldering my bamboo basket, I approached. Silas shoved the still-crying baby girl into my arms. "Drown her," he said, his voice low and menacing. "And I'll give you half a bun." It wasn't the first time a baby girl had been drowned in the village. Ragnar always said that girls ate too much and worked too little. It was cheaper to buy a wife than to raise a daughter. He said my mother, a university graduate, had only cost less than 2,000 yuan. Raising a girl, feeding her until she could bear children, would cost 3,000 or 4,000. Girls raised in the village had to work. Their skin became dark and rough from the sun and wind. They aged quickly. It was better to have a kidnapped woman, young and pretty. So, the village rarely had girls. There were exceptions, like Helga, who was kidnapped along with her 5-year-old daughter. The girl was said to be exquisite, like a porcelain doll. Helga's husband, Bjorn, pampered her, fed her well, and never let her work. When she was old enough, the men of the village began to visit her. Sometimes one at a time, sometimes many, sometimes with Helga, sometimes alone. They always seemed to enjoy themselves. Bjorn would sit outside, collecting the coins, sometimes 1 yuan, sometimes 50 cents. With Helga and the girl, Bjorn didn't even need to work the fields. By the time I had memories, the girl was a young woman. When the wife traders came, Bjorn presented her to them, and received several red banknotes in exchange. Their current house was built with that money. After Bjorn built his house, the villagers were envious. They all came to sleep with my mother. She was far more beautiful than Helga, and they all said that her daughter would surely be even more beautiful. But my mother never conceived again. I took the baby girl from Silas. She was wrinkled, her skin a mottled bluish purple. But her cries were loud, her chubby limbs flailing. A basin of water had already been placed on the stone table. I lowered the baby into the water, face up. She cried and thrashed, as if she were swimming, supported by my hands. The onlookers gathered around, their eyes gleaming with morbid curiosity. I released her. She struggled desperately. Water splashed everywhere. She coughed violently, a sound even louder than her previous cries. The men roared with laughter. The women kept their distance. "Hold her down! Hold her down!" Ragnar yelled. "You're splashing me." My mother had never allowed me to watch them drown the baby girls, but I had seen it from afar, perched on the branches of a fruit tree on the mountain. I was about to mimic their actions, to press down on the baby's flailing limbs, when I was suddenly shoved to the ground. It was my mother. She pinned me down, striking me wildly. "I'll kill you. You monster. You deserve to die." I curled up on the ground, yelping in pain. My mother continued to beat me relentlessly. Ragnar and the others laughed uproariously. "Look, the madwoman's having another fit. Hit her, mute. Hit that crazy woman." My mother held me down, panting heavily. Her eyes were red-rimmed, filled with tears. I didn't understand her fury. The village drowned so many baby girls every year. Just as I didn't understand why she insisted on binding my chest every day. I liked the way my breasts were starting to swell slightly. It made me feel like her. My face was bruised and swollen from my mother's beating. While she was hitting me, Ragnar drowned the newborn girl. The sound of the baby's choking mixed with my mother's cries, a chilling symphony. The baby girl was quickly drowned. The village dogs barked and fought over the tiny body. My mother fastened the dog leash around my neck, shouting wildly, "Walk the dog! Kill the dog! Chop the dog child into pieces and boil it." The onlookers dispersed, laughing. Some asked, "How many pots will we need to boil the dog child?" My mother tugged on the leash. "Fong, bite him! Bite him!" I didn't move. The person who had asked the question went off to the feast, chuckling. My mother led me with the leash towards the mountains outside the village. Silas said this place was a peach blossom spring, a mythical paradise. He said the mountain god protected the men of the village, ensuring that their livestock, poultry, and women were safe from outsiders. The villagers said that after my father died, our house, without anyone to repair it, collapsed. From my earliest memories, I had lived with my mother in a makeshift shack at the foot of the mountain. There were some mountain guards who guarded the only mountain path leading in and out of the village. At first, they wouldn't let us near, but my mother went into the bushes with one of them for a long time, and after that, we were allowed to build our shack here. I waited a long time for my mother to return. She brought back a flashlight. When she switched it on, I saw dust motes dancing in the beam of light. My mother ran her fingers through my tangled hair. "Does it hurt?" It did. But not as much as before. I wasn't truly mute. It was just that, ever since I could remember, my mother had forbidden me from speaking in public. If I disobeyed, she would hit me. So, speaking was difficult. I could only speak one word at a time, haltingly. "No, hurt, no." Tears streamed down my mother's face. "Seraphina," she whispered, using my secret name, cupping my face. "How could you kill? It was just a bun, just a bun." I looked at her, confused. But it was a bun. A white, steaming, fragrant, soft bun. How many chances would I have in my life to eat a bun? I couldn't even remember the last time I had eaten one. My mother looked at me, her eyes reddening again. She hugged me tightly, sobbing. She cried as if a newly bought wife had run away. She cried for a long time until my waist went numb. I thought of the baby girl being devoured by the dogs. Why wouldn't she let me drown her? If I didn't do it, someone else would. If I had done it, Ragnar would have given me a fragrant white bun. I would have shared the bun with my mother. Half each. No, I would give her the bigger half. I would eat the smaller one. My mother had to do farm work, cook, gather firewood, and repair the shack every day. My mother was so tired. If I could have gotten a fragrant white bun, I would have given my mother the bigger half. I only needed a little bit. My mother finally stopped crying. She began to repeat what she had been repeating for years. Seraphina, she said. Tell me again, what are you going to do after you cross the mountains? I didn't understand the point of these questions. Everyone knew that you couldn't cross the mountains. The village was the whole world. But I cooperated. After crossing the mountains, I will walk towards the setting sun for a long time, passing 3 villages with many people. Then, in the 4th village, I will find a shop and smash everything inside. What if the shopkeeper hits you? Call the police, let him call the police, let him ask my grandfather for compensation. My grandfather's name is Chen Guoqiang, and he lives in Garden Community, Sana City. He has a daughter named Chen Shuxiang. Shuxiang as in fragrant scholar. Tears rolled down my mother's cheeks. Seraphina, you will have many white buns in the future. You will have meat and vegetables, fragrant and delicious. You will wear beautiful dresses, and you will go to school. You will meet a man who respects you and loves you. You will have a happy life. To comfort her, I nodded. My mother's madness was clearly getting worse. How could there be many white buns? I was only 11, but I was a big girl now. I had a clear and accurate understanding of the world. White buns were only available at feasts. Only Ragnar and the wife traders could eat meat and vegetables. Beautiful dresses were something my mother hallucinated because of her madness. Women were just livestock for men to bear children and work. How could a man respect and love livestock? Although my mother always fantasized about turning me into a boy, I was a girl. How could I possibly have a happy life? As long as I could sell myself for a good price in the future, so that my mother could live a less difficult life, I would be content. The next day, before dawn, I was awakened by a woman's cries. Please. Let me go. I'll give you money. My family has a lot of money, I'll give you more. It was the day the wife traders were delivering their goods. It was clearly a new arrival struggling. I was used to it. I had seen many women like this. At first, most of them were very fierce, but after a few beatings, they became docile. The fiercer the woman, the more severely she was beaten. So, the other women in the village would advise them, don't struggle, accept your fate. My mother never said that. She told me that this was a village of traffickers, that all the women were kidnapped. The men here were all damned, they would all face retribution. At first, I believed her without question, but as I grew older, I began to feel that something was wrong. Did retribution really exist? They seemed to be living very happily. The struggling woman was dragged out. She was stripped naked in public. The men of the village surrounded her, her cries and screams were drowned out by the men's laughter. Ragnar's son, only 7 years old, joined the men, touching and biting. My mother covered my eyes. Don't look. But I had seen it many times before. I couldn't forget the women's anguished howls, their despair, and the men's constant joy. My mother was clearly planning something. She said to me, tell me again, what's your grandfather's name? I said, grandfather's name is Chen Guoqiang, and he lives in Garden Community, Sana City. He has a daughter named Chen Shuxiang. Shuxiang as in fragrant scholar. My mother nodded, tears in her eyes. Don't worry, everything will be all right. Soon. I promise you. The men's revelry continued for a long time. Finally, as usual, the trader impaled his merchandise on himself, and walked with everyone towards the village. Only after they had gone far did my mother carefully emerge with me. She, as usual, took out the iron chain to shackle me. The villagers had all gone to watch the excitement. Only a few old women with mobility issues were sitting at the village entrance. They were the first batch of goods sold here. Originally, they were to be resold to other families because they couldn't bear children, but because they had given birth to many male babies, they were exceptionally allowed to stay in the village to look after the newly bought women. Before my mother and I reached them, we could hear them cracking melon seeds. "That new girl in the pink dress is something, isn't she? So saucy, so white," several men were fighting over her. Yes, that girl kept crying, so good at pretending to be pitiful." Old Lee's kid was staring with his mouth open. "The other one isn't bad either, big hips, good for bearing children. We have to keep an eye on them. If those two get together and start plotting, who knows what they'll come up with." My mother led me up to them and threw a handful of dirt at them. The old women were blinded, and they started cursing. They cursed so quickly, I couldn't understand. My mother clapped her hands and laughed madly. "Ha ha ha, old hags, unwanted." One of the old women was so angry that she threw her cane at my mother. "Jinx. Stinking widow. Husband-killing madwoman, you just want a man. Old Jang's ghost will come back tonight and screw you. Screw your son's back door too." My mother was trembling with rage. Just then, a few men walked out of the village in twos and threes. They were the children of these old women. My mother shook the dog leash around my neck, something shimmering in her eyes. Giddy up, horse, run." I ran, and my mother held the reins behind me. The old women complained to the men. Soon, a man chased after us. He pushed my mother to the ground. I immediately charged at the man. Before I could reach him, I was lifted up. Slap. I received a solid slap across the face, making my head spin. The men laughed heartily. "Stupid boy, running around like that. Rushing to screw your mother, are you?" My mouth was filled with the taste of blood, which I had to swallow. I was a little scared and wanted to run, but the person holding me was very strong. I couldn't break free. My mother was pinned to the ground, shouting, "Dog child. Don't kill my dog child." The men's attention was drawn to my mother. The leading man, with a mouthful of yellow teeth, walked over with a lewd grin. "Hey, it really is about screwing his mother, let's go." The men laughed. Except for the one holding me, everyone else went over. City women are really different, white, tender, and fragrant. That's right, but we can only make do with the madwoman. They started tearing at my mother's clothes. Just then, Ragnar arrived with 4 strong relatives. My father was Ragnar's cousin, so my mother was Ragnar's cousin-in-law. Ragnar saw what was happening and immediately rolled up his sleeves. "Having a feast without me? That's not right." The first few men made way. Ragnar, with his 4 relatives, carried my mother to the nearest house. The men swarmed inside. I was suspended in the air, unable to do anything. The bed in the house shook violently. Through the dilapidated window, I saw my mother sandwiched between several men. The other men formed a circle around them, waiting. Ragnar sighed with satisfaction. What a pity, such a beautiful madwoman gave birth to a male baby. If the mute were a girl, she'd be just the right age. Someone immediately chimed in, just the right age for what? Ragnar laughed and scolded, "Stupid, what do you think? A few more days until she starts bleeding, and she could bear us children in turns." Right, no problem. The men became excited. Isn't that what the cripple in Wong family village next door did? He broke his daughter's cherry and she gave birth to several big, fat boys. The mute isn't that young either. If his father were still alive, he should have taken him to open his cherry. Ragnar beckoned to the man holding me. Bring the mute in, I'll teach him how to be a man. A warm flow suddenly gushed between my legs. My mother lunged forward. Ragnar let out a scream of pain. The man holding me immediately dropped me and rushed into the house. I fell to the ground. I reached inside my trousers, and my hand came away covered in blood. The men surrounded my mother. My body kept bleeding. I was terrified, and I ran back to the shack I shared with my mother. It was almost dark when my mother returned. Her clothes were completely torn, and her body was covered in injuries. She sat in front of me, very serious, and asked softly, "Are you bleeding down there?" I nodded, my feelings complex. My mother's expression was so serious. Was I seriously ill? Was I going to die? I wasn't afraid of death. Death was more comfortable than living. But I couldn't bear to leave my mother. My mother tore a strip of cloth from my clothes, wrapped it between my legs, and tied it around my waist. Then, she loosened the soil on the ground with her feet, rubbing it back and forth. Only then did I realize that, at some point, the blood had flowed down my thighs and onto the ground. The scattered red marks on the ground were very conspicuous. After doing all this, she touched my face, her eyes holding an emotion I couldn't understand. "Seraphina, you're growing up." "Does bleeding mean growing up?" My mother was stunned. For a long, long time, she smiled at me, tears in her eyes. "Yes. You have to bleed to grow up." I felt like we were talking about different things, but I didn't know exactly what was different. I hugged my mother's arm tightly. "Mother, I don't want to pretend to be mute, and I don't want to be a dog child. Let's not go back. Let's live in the mountains forever, okay?" My mother pulled her arm away. "You must leave this mountain." I didn't want to leave the mountain. The people in the village were too scary. But I had to listen to my mother. If I didn't listen, she would hit me, and it would hurt a lot, so I nodded. My mother took me to a hole in the ground and covered the entrance with weeds. "Tonight, no matter what happens, don't leave here." I nodded. My mother limped away alone. The night brought a torrential downpour. Rain dripped through the cracks in our makeshift shelter, growing steadily worse. I was soaked to the bone, huddled in a corner, desperately wishing for my mother's return. The storm raged, punctuated by flashes of lightning and deafening thunder. The cellar was damp and frigid, and I shivered uncontrollably. The bleeding between my legs continued, a constant, worrying flow. Later that night, the water level in the cellar began to rise. A sharp, cramping pain twisted in my stomach, as if I'd been kicked repeatedly. Outside, the storm continued its fury, mixed with the sporadic barking of dogs and the shouts of men. As dawn approached, accompanied by the heart-wrenching sobs of a woman, I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. My mother returned after the rain had stopped. She carried a pouch filled with ash from burnt wood. She helped me secure it between my legs, to stem the flow of blood. My mother explained that it was menstruation, a sign of a woman's sexual maturity. After menstruation began, a woman could have children. "Why does bleeding have to happen before having children?" I asked. "Because before a baby can grow, a nourishing home must be prepared for it. The blood that flows out is the dismantling of an unused home." "Why build and dismantle, build and dismantle? Why not just leave it there?" "Because a fetus takes nourishment from the mother's body. Carrying a fetus is very dangerous for the mother. When the mother's body can't support the fetus, it will expel the fetus and the placenta through a miscarriage. Menstruation is a practice run for miscarriage." I remembered the moment Ragnar had wanted to initiate me, and how my mother had lunged at him to protect me. I asked my mother, if the fetus is a burden to the mother, why not kill the fetus? My mother gently stroked my hair. "The fetus has no choice about landing in the mother's womb. They are innocent. The one who should die is the person who forces the fetus upon the mother." My mother cooked me a large pot of hot soup. After drinking it, my stomach felt much better. She took me to a clearing in the woods to wash my face. I quickly covered the mud on my face. "Don't wipe it off, Mother. If you clean my face, you won't want me anymore." Since I was a child, my mother had warned me never to wipe the mud off my face. She said if she ever found the mud gone, she would chase me away and never want me again. But this time, she gently scooped up water from the stream. "It's all right. Just for a look. Then we'll put it back on." And so, I saw myself for the first time. It was a strange, unfamiliar face. Round eyes, a tiny button nose, cracked lips with traces of blood, a pointed chin. The face was pale, completely clean, but I felt as if I were exposed, completely uncomfortable. After just one glance, I averted my eyes, awkwardly covering my face, leaving only my eyes visible. My mother noticed my actions and gently pulled my hands away. "Seraphina is beautiful. When you leave the village, you must wash your face clean every day to meet people." "Huh?" I gasped in surprise, suddenly feeling lost and confused about life outside the village. My mother didn't answer. She smeared the mud back onto my face, and I quickly helped. This was right. My face had to be covered. It started to rain again, a moderate drizzle, the sky a dull gray. My mother and I returned to the ruins of our old house in the village. A newly purchased woman was locked in the woodshed next door. Her hands and feet were shackled with iron chains. As soon as she saw my mother and me, she became agitated, shouting and crying, her face streaked with tears. "Help me, please, help me." My mother and I remained unmoved, pretending not to see her. She cried, "You're women too. If you have any conscience, help me escape." I was terrified. How did she know I was a woman? If the others found out, I would be forced to bear children for all the men in the village. My mother, wearing a straw raincoat, picked up a brick and threw it. She missed, and the brick hit the wall. "Open your dog eyes and see clearly. I bore old Zhang a son. If you keep yelling, I'll rip your mouth apart." The woman was frightened into silence. My mother spat and said to me, "Dog child, close the door." As soon as I closed the door to the adjacent woodshed opened. The iron chains clattered, and the woman whimpered. Jart's voice was lazy. "Girl, don't even think about it. Sooner or later, you'll have to marry. Stay with me, and I'll treat you well." Do you know how the madwoman went mad? She wouldn't listen, so she was sent to the mountains to be a breeding sow. A breeding sow, you know? The kind that just keeps having babies, no matter whose seed it is, as long as it can produce offspring. Pigs, dogs, monkeys, anything goes. My mother's jawline tightened, her teeth clenched together. The woman's anguished screams came from next door. "Beasts. Worse than pigs and dogs. You don't treat women like humans, you'll face retribution." Jart laughed heartily. "Ha ha ha, I spent money to buy a wife, what's wrong with having a few children? You're pretty, that's why I'm talking to you so much. You'd better know what's good for you, or you'll be thrown into the forest to be a breeding sow. Nobody will want you when you come back to the village." The cries from next door gradually subsided. They were replaced by the laughter of men. Through the wall, I could hear the sound of the bed creaking. Jart was just humming when there was a sudden scream. My mother rushed out and grappled with the fleeing woman. I didn't understand why she was doing this. Jart, clutching his trousers, rushed out and dragged the woman back inside. My mother said, "Stay inside. No matter what happens, don't come out." Then she sat on the threshold of Jart's house. When the cries from next door finally stopped, and Jart came out to relieve himself, my mother, abandoning her usual mad demeanor, said, "Give me a few dates. I can convince that little girl to accept her fate and live with you." The other women in the village often said, "Accept your fate." But this was the first time I had heard these words from my mother. The old people in the village died, and everyone said it was their destiny. The purchased women were forced to have children, and everyone said it was a woman's destiny. Old Liv, in her 70s, with a limp, washed clothes and cooked for her 2 sons every day, yet she was still scolded and beaten, often going hungry. Everyone said it was her destiny. But my mother taught me that destiny was determined by people. If you couldn't hold it in your own hands, it would be taken away by others. It rained again after dark. My mother went to persuade the new bride next door. There was no firewood at home, so there was no way to get warm. I could only huddle in a corner and sleep alone. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by the shouts of the villagers. Someone shouted, "Quick, chase her! The new little bride has run away." The crowd first rushed to Jart's house. Because Jart's woman had resisted most fiercely during the day. The woman and Jart came out together. She was flushed, wearing only a coat. Jart said, "It's not my wife who ran away." The woman, uncharacteristically, was completely obedient to him. After the crowd dispersed, the bed creaked for a long time. My mother didn't come back. At dawn, the rain stopped. The fleeing woman was caught and brought back. The villagers all came out to watch. My mother wouldn't let me see, but she squeezed into the crowd herself. The woman next door, her eyes red and swollen, was looking outside. I quietly slipped out. Just then, I saw Ragnar and his men approaching. My mother was at the front of the crowd. I was afraid she would see me, so I quickly hid behind the wall. The woman in the pink dress was brought back, shackled with iron chains. I knew the man who bought her. It was Leaf, the one with the crippled right leg. Leaf, almost 50, was furious, punishing the pink-clad woman. He held a whip used for driving cattle and sheep, and he lashed the woman again and again. The woman's hair was disheveled, her body covered in mud. She wore an iron chain around her neck. Leaf's whipping made it difficult for her to walk. She kept struggling. But it was useless, because 2 people were holding her down. The woman roared, shouting, why won't you let me die? I'd rather die than stay here. If you have the guts, just kill me." My mother hopped and danced around the woman, waving her arms. Go die, go die." Leaf lashed out at my mother with the whip, but my mother dodged it. "Madwoman, what are you yelling about? Get out of here." Then he grabbed the woman's hair. "You want to die before giving me a son? Dream on. It seems I was too good to you the other day." He and several other men pinned the woman to the ground and brought out torches, needles, and ink. "Today, I'll tattoo the names of everyone in the village all over your body. Let's see where you run. Let's see how you live after you run." The woman's pink clothes were torn to shreds. Leaf scorched the tip of the needle with fire, dipped it in ink, and stabbed the woman's inner thigh. The woman screamed incessantly. Leaf finished tattooing the name and handed the needle to Ragnar. Ragnar also dipped it in ink and tattooed his name on the woman's chest. Next, it was Silas's turn. Just then, Ragnar saw me. "Hey, you little brat," following silently behind. "You want to watch too?" I kept my mouth shut and turned to leave. Ragnar grabbed me. "What are you shy about? You're not a man. When I was your age, I could already deflower new brides. Come on, your uncle will show you something fun." I panicked. If my mother saw me so close to the men of the village, she would be angry. Ragnar was holding my collar. I wanted him to let go, but I couldn't break his grip. I was practically dragged by Ragnar. When the villagers saw Ragnar coming, they made way. Seeing me being dragged by Ragnar, they casually hit me a couple of times. "Hey, this mute boy is here. It's rare to see him in a crowd. This is a surprise. I think he's grown up and come to see how to open his cherry." The men roared with laughter. I was at a loss, and the warm flow between my legs intensified. The ash my mother had changed for me yesterday seemed to be full. Soon, I was dragged to the center of the crowd by Ragnar. The woman was pinned to the stone table at the entrance, and she had just fainted. Leaf spat. Useless. She fainted already. Well, I'll trouble you all to carry her inside for me. She was like a freshly slaughtered suckling pig, white, tender, delicate, at the mercy of others. After she was lifted, I noticed red blood on the stone table. Ragnar pushed me forward. Wait, Leaf, this mute boy hasn't had his cherry opened yet. Let him do it before you move her. The surrounding people burst into laughter. I didn't understand what they were laughing at. It wasn't until Ragnar started to pull down my pants that I realized they wanted me to be naked like the woman on the stone table. No. Absolutely not. I started to struggle desperately. Someone nearby slapped me. You little bastard, what are you moving for? If it weren't for you being so young, you wouldn't even get a turn with this new bride. The slap was a bit heavy, and I could only tightly grip my pants. The warm flow between my legs intensified. I remembered that day, when Ragnar said, if the mute were a girl, she'd be just the right age. I absolutely couldn't let them know I was a girl. I didn't want to bear children in turns for all the men in the village. My limbs were firmly grasped by the men, and Ragnar grabbed my waistband and pulled down. Suddenly, a brick landed at his feet. My mother rushed over, acting crazed. What are you doing? Are you going to kill my dog child and cook him? No. No. I can't bear to eat him, I can't give him to you. She suddenly burst into laughter, pointing at Ragnar. You're the smallest. You're the fastest. You're no good. Ha 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 ha. Ragnar's face immediately changed. Madwoman, why are we still keeping her? Come on, grab her with me. My mother turned and ran. Ragnar and the others chased after her. I was left standing there, the warm flow between my legs even more intense. My mother had told me that the cloth in my pants was very important. No matter what happened, it had to be changed when it was full. I returned to the house in the village, which was in ruins, to find the ash my mother had burned in a small jar under the wall. The aroma of food from Jart's house wafted out. It smelled so good, I swallowed hard. I lay on the broken wall and peeked inside his window. On the table were porridge, radish vegetables, and a plate of oily scrambled eggs. Jart, his mother, and his wife were eating. My mouth involuntarily chewed along, as if I were also eating scrambled eggs. A chopstick full of eggs was placed in the woman's bowl. His mother said, "Eat more, girl. Get fat so you can have children." The woman didn't answer. I stared intently. Jart noticed me. A stone was thrown at me. Beggar, what are you looking at? I was getting hungrier and hungrier. My mother still hadn't returned. I didn't know what was wrong with me. Usually, I could go a whole day just drinking water, but today, I couldn't even go half a day without food. Just then, Jart's window opened. A woman's hand extended from the window frame, holding a fragrant egg pancake. I looked up and saw that it was Jart's newly bought wife. She asked me, "Do you want to eat?" Afraid I wouldn't understand, she pointed to the pancake in her hand and made a gesture of offering it. I swallowed, my soul drawn by the egg pancake, and nodded. She handed me the pancake, and I devoured it in 2 or 3 bites. It was so delicious. I carefully licked the oil from my hands. The woman's eyes reddened. "Don't lick, your hands are dirty. I'll get you more." She brought me 2 more pancakes and a cup of clean water. I ate 1 pancake, drank the water, wrapped the other pancake in a leaf, and hid it in my clothes. The woman pointed to her own rear end. "You have blood there, are you injured?" I also mimicked her gesture, pulling at my pants to look. There was indeed a patch of blood. Nothing hurt, it must have been my period staining my pants. I shook my head. The woman was about to say something when there was movement inside the house. I quickly squatted down, and she immediately returned inside. It was Jart entering the room. He chuckled, "Wife, isn't my mother's egg pancake delicious?" The woman replied, "Yes, it's delicious." I crouched in the corner, not daring to move. The bed next door started creaking again. My legs went numb from squatting, but my mother still didn't return. The bed finally fell silent. I clutched the pancake in my arms and slipped out from under the wall to find my mother. The fleeing woman was locked in the pigsty by Leaf. She was naked, the chain nailed to the wall, staring at the sky like a fool. I ignored her and continued searching for my mother. Then I suddenly remembered that I hadn't changed the ash in my menstrual cloth, so I hurried back to change it. I met my mother at the entrance. She was lying on the ground, crawling forward, struggling to breathe. I quickly ran over and helped her up. Her left arm was injured by a brick, swollen and bleeding. I burst into tears. My mother said, "Don't cry, let's go home." Where was our home? Only a pile of broken walls left by my father. Wiping away my tears, I struggled to support my mother. Her arm was immobile, as if sewn to her side, swinging with our movements. I quickly helped her into the corner between two sections of wall. Under the ruins was an overturned clay pot containing medicinal herbs I had gathered a few days earlier. I quickly dug them out and clumsily applied them to my mother's arm. But my mother grabbed my hand. "Did you change the ash? Why are your pants stained?" Only then did I realize that the menstrual cloth was completely soaked. The blood had overflowed, staining my pants. Fortunately, my pants were a dull gray, so it only looked like a darker patch. I patted it with my hand. "Never mind, it's not noticeable." "Mom, I brought you an egg pancake." My mother stared at the egg pancake for a while. "Where did you get it?" "The woman next door gave it to me." "You went to Jart's house?" I nodded. The noisy voices of men could be heard in the distance. "Are you sure it was the mute bleeding?" "Of course, I saw her walking in front of me. But the mute urinates standing up." "Have any of you seen her bird?" The voices grew closer. The one leading them was Jart. My mother punched me hard in the face. I was knocked to the ground. The egg pancake fell, covered in dust. My nose started bleeding profusely. She pounced on me, straddling me, hitting and cursing like a madwoman. Her blood splattered everywhere. Her dislocated arm swung like a pendulum. I covered my nose, screaming, covered in blood. When the men arrived, they saw this absurd scene. "Oh, it's just a nosebleed." I was thinking, if it was a girl's first period, we could have had some fun. The madwoman is so injured, how does she have the strength to beat the mute? Whether it's a boy or a girl, just pull down the pants and see. If they pulled down my pants, could I still escape? My heart was in my throat. Ragnar clicked his tongue in disgust. "You pull them down if you want. Covered in the madwoman's mess, it's disgusting." Before I could breathe a sigh of relief, Silas said, "What's there to be afraid of? Just wash it clean. Let your wife serve you, it's fun." A man grabbed my mother's shoulder. My mother struggled wildly, and was dragged away. I lay on the ground, my face covered in blood. Silas put his hand on my waistband. My mother struggled desperately, moving towards me, but was easily dragged away by the men. Just when I thought everything was about to end, there was a commotion next door. Jart's mother came out. "Jart, stop it," she said, with Jart's new wife. "Tomorrow is your wedding, you can't see blood today. It's bad luck, you'll have stinky girls." What? A wedding? There had never been a bride in this village who didn't have to be tied up for the ceremony. The new wife said, "Yes, Jart, I've thought it through. I want to live a good life with you, give you a bunch of fat boys. Let's have the wedding tomorrow. We'll have as many tables of wine as sons will have." The wedding day was very lively, and everyone in the village was very happy. The men surrounded Jart, asking him how he did it. Jart was very happy, saying he was good in bed, and the men all laughed and cursed. The women were in the backyard cooking, cleaning, and preparing decorations for the wedding. My mother was also dragged to work. She only had one arm that could move, but she still had to be responsible for the fire. She had to make all the stoves burn hot. The bride soon came out. Jart hugged her tightly, but he couldn't stop some people from touching her chest or buttocks. He was very angry and asked the children to send the woman back. I also followed and turned to the back room. The villagers said that weddings were joyous occasions, and everyone liked to make a lot of noise late into the night. They ate and drank from noon until evening. After dark, they started the bridal chamber teasing. A lot of people came into the room at once. The woman and Jart were surrounded. Jart took off his shirt and pressed the woman onto the bed. The men and boys roared with laughter. I quickly retreated. My mother never allowed me to see these things. Whenever someone got married, when it came to the bridal chamber teasing, I would go help. My mother gathered firewood. Although everyone had finished eating, they hadn't left yet. There was a lot of leftover meat on the table. Normally, I wasn't allowed to sit at the table during feasts, so this was also my time to eat. I ran to the kitchen as usual, but I found that my mother wasn't working as usual. She was holding a small package, as if she had been waiting for me for a long time. I got closer and saw that it contained food, drinks, and a few colorful banknotes. My mother looked at me with a smile and said, "Seraphina, tell me again, what are you going to do after you cross the mountains?" I recited fluently, walked towards the setting sun for a long time, passing 3 villages with many people. Then, in the 4th village, find a shop and smash everything inside. Let him call the police, let him ask my grandfather for compensation. My grandfather's name is Chen Guoqiang, and he lives in Garden Community, Sana City. He has a daughter named Chen Shuxiang. Shuxiang as in fragrant scholar. This time, my mother didn't cry. She smiled and kissed my forehead. I said, "Mom, don't kiss me, it's dirty." My mother said, "Forget me and this place. Go outside and find your own life." I said I didn't understand. She pointed to the mountain path leading away. "See this road? Follow it all the way, no matter what happens, don't stop, don't look back." No one had ever escaped along this road. I shook my head repeatedly. "No, Mother, I'll be caught and brought back." My mother said, "No one will come after you. Mother will set off a brilliant firework in the village for you." I still didn't understand. But how could my mother harm me? I nodded and picked up a bun from the table. "Okay, I'll run along this road, and no matter what happens, I won't look back." My mother took the bun from my hand. "Don't eat food or drink water from the village. Isn't there plenty of food in the package? Be content, don't be greedy." "Then when can I come back and find you?" My mother was stunned. She thought for a long time before saying, "Mother will leave this place and hide in a place only grandfather knows. So, you must find grandfather, understand?" I followed the road out of the mountain. The villagers said it was a dead end, and only those approved by Ragnar could pass. In fact, it was true. For 11 years, no one had been able to leave here without Ragnar's permission. The lights of the bridal chamber receded further and further. The crowd inside was gathered together in celebration. I heard someone cursing. "Damn it, who spilled so much flour?" But they quickly returned to their previous revelry. The small room must have been packed with people. They were making noise and tossing the flour around. Silas kept shouting, reminding everyone not to smoke, forbidding open flames, saying that the flour concentration in the room was so high that it could easily cause a dust explosion. I walked further and further away, and the sound of the bridal chamber grew fainter. Suddenly, a blinding red light struck from behind me. I turned around and was blinded by the dazzling firelight of the bridal chamber. For a time I was blinded by the intense light and couldn't see anything. It was the most magnificent firework I had ever seen in my life. The revelry in the bridal chamber stopped. The fire burned half the sky red. The villagers were all busy running to put out the fire. Even the guards watching the mountain path went to find buckets of water. The fire burned brightly, illuminating the path out of the village. In the chaos, I didn't see my mother. I turned and ran forward quickly. Mother would leave this place and hide in a place only grandfather knew. I would definitely find her.